This is the third of 3 videos dealing with the subject of bat mitzvah, but the subject of bat mitzvah in each of these videos is really only a springboard for dealing with the larger issue of the status of women in Judaism. So in the first video, I examined a Talmudic legal principle, which is a general principle, there are exceptions, but a principle which women are exempt from positive time-bound commandments. And I suggested that the reason for that principle may have been that it reflected a Talmudic ideal. This is not a biblical ideal, a Talmudic ideal, that the place of the woman is in the home. And I argued in that first video that, in my personal view, such a Talmudic principle that women are exempt from positive time-bound commandments does not constitute discrimination to the detriment of women, because according to such a principle, women are not prohibited from doing anything, they're simply exempt, not required to do such commandments. I also argued that I don't think the Talmudic ideal that the place of a woman is to be in the home reflects discrimination to the detriment of women, because even for those of us who may not identify with such an ideal, the ideal is simply that, an ideal, and in practice, in the Talmudic tradition, a woman was free to work outside of the home if that's what she wanted. In the second video and in this third video, I am in a much more direct way addressing the larger issue of the status of women in Judaism. So in the second video, and in both of these videos, the second video and in this third video, I am arguing that in my view, there is very clearly discrimination to the detriment of women, and that women have, in my view, very clearly an inferior status to that of men in Jewish law. So that in the second video, I cited 2 Talmudic sources in which very clearly is implied that women have an inferior status to that of men in Jewish law. And I discussed 2 issues, the issue of divorce and the issue of women being ineligible to witness in a Jewish court of law, rabbinic court of law, and argued that I think it reflected in both of those issues is very clearly, in my eyes, discrimination to the detriment of women in Judaism. So now in this third video, I want to discuss 3 issues in which women in traditional Judaism have been excluded from ritual practices, have been excluded by way of custom and not by law. That women are not prohibited from doing these practices, and yet they've been excluded by way of custom. And in particular, I want to focus upon the contemporary Orthodox world, modern Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, in which to this day women are, on a widespread basis, are excluded from such practices, again by way of custom and not by way of law. But before I begin, I want to repeat 2 points by way of general background that I made in the second video. Point number 1, I very much identify with my Orthodox background and lifestyle. I do not identify with an Orthodox conception of Judaism from a philosophic point of view. I very much identify with my Orthodox background, that I belong to the modern Orthodox, not ultra-Orthodox world. And I identify with my Orthodox background and Orthodox lifestyle. I emphasize this because in these 2 videos, I am voicing criticism of orthodoxy, and I intend such criticism to be of a constructive nature, constructive criticism. Point number 2, I am not a rabbi, not ordained as a rabbi. I'm a teacher of Jewish studies, and in not having rabbinic ordination, I'm not authorized to teach practical law, what's permissible and forbidden. And so in dealing with legal issues in these videos, dealing with the status of women in Judaism, in dealing with legal issues, and in general as a teacher of Jewish studies when I deal with legal issues, I'm not dealing with such issues in terms of practical law, permissible and forbidden. I'm dealing with the issues from a philosophic point of view. My purpose is not to teach permissible and forbidden. My purpose is simply from a philosophic point of view to stimulate thinking and hopefully to stimulate further discussion of issues. So, the first issue that I want to discuss, in which women have been excluded by way of custom from practices in Judaism, the first issue that I want to discuss is reading from the Torah. In the synagogue, we have a practice in which we read a portion from the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, on Sabbath and holidays, and on Mondays and Thursdays during the weekdays. So on the Sabbath and holidays, it's a longer portion that we read. On Mondays and Thursdays, it's a shorter portion. On the Sabbath, 7 people are called to read from the portion. And on Mondays and Thursdays, it's only 3 people. On holidays, it's various numbers in between. So to go back to the Talmud, Talmudic law, women are permitted to read from the Torah the same as men. There is no distinction whatsoever. This is not a requirement for men or women to read from the Torah. It's really an honor, but both men and women are permitted to read from the Torah, and no distinction whatsoever. But already in the Talmudic period, there was a custom that developed in which women were not to read from the Torah. And the reason the Talmud gives that women should not read from the Torah is because of the public honor, public respect, kavod hatzibur in Hebrew. And now it's not clear what that means, public honor, public respect, a matter of speculation. Shortly I'll suggest what I think is the most plausible explanation, not original on my part. But first, some background. In the Talmudic period, when a person reads from the Torah, that meant in the Talmudic practice that the person would read the passage from the Torah, blessing before and blessing after, a short blessing before and a short blessing after, and reading the passage. Yeah. In our time, most people do not know how to read from the Torah. It's really difficult and it requires preparation. There are some people who do continue the Talmudic practice and read for themselves, and they prepare and read for themselves and say the blessing before and after. But in virtually every synagogue today, in the Orthodox world as well, there's a professional reader, so that somebody who reads from the Torah actually only makes the blessing before and after, and the professional reader reads on their behalf. And now to go back then to the Talmud, the public honor, the public respect, the reason given by the Talmud that women shouldn't read. What I think the most plausible explanation is that if a woman was called to read in the Talmudic period and she knew how to read, women generally in the Talmudic period were not educated, they weren't taught. So if she knew how to read and there were men who didn't know how to read in the community, that would be an embarrassment to the men. And therefore, that's what was meant by public honor, public respect, that women should not read. And that, I think, we can understand, even if we might identify with such a view, we can at least understand that there was a reason for the custom then, if that's the explanation, custom of women not reading from the Torah. But in our day, if that's the explanation of public honor, public respect, it has no relevance in our day. It doesn't make sense in our day. In any case, most men today do not read for themselves, so that there's a professional reader, so there's no reason why women in our day should not be called to read from the Torah. And the fact that women aren't, widespread in the Orthodox world, women are not called to read from the Torah, is in my mind, reflects discrimination to the detriment of women. So the second issue that I want to discuss is the commandment of Talmud Torah, the study of Torah. Talmud here means study. Now Talmud also is, of course, the Babylonian Talmud, the foundation of the Jewish rabbinic tradition. And in the Talmudic literature, there are 2 Talmuds, the Babylonian, the Jerusalem. It's for a variety of historical reasons. The Babylonian Talmud became the authoritative Talmud, the foundation of the Jewish tradition. But when we speak of the commandment of study of Torah, central commandment of the Jewish traditions, Talmud Torah means study of Torah. But the essence of this commandment of study of Torah, the essence in traditional Judaism is rigorous intellectual study of texts, and in the main, the study of Talmudic texts, Talmudic learning, the study of the Talmud as the foundation of the rabbinic tradition. This is the essence of Jewish learning from a traditional Jewish point of view. So to go back to the Talmud, man is required, the Jewish man is required to study, which means, again, rigorous intellectual study, and especially Talmudic learning. A man is required to study Torah, and a woman is exempt from such study. Now, in the Talmud, there's a debate whether women should be taught Torah even though they're exempt and not required. Should they be taught? And as should a father teach his daughter Torah? And there's a debate, there's an opinion that it's obligatory to teach a woman Torah, and there's an opinion that she shouldn't be taught. Not forbidden, but she shouldn't. In any case, that's simply a matter of custom, that this opinion that women should not be taught Torah became widely accepted by way of custom in the Jewish world, so that through the ages in traditional Judaism, women were not taught the same as men. Generally, what women were taught was they were not taught Talmud. They were taught simply some Bible, and in terms of Jewish law, laws that related to their functioning in the home, that of taking care of a home, so that women had to know dietary laws and marital laws regulating the sexual marital life in the home. So, again, still widespread in the Orthodox world to this day, women are not taught the same as men, and not taught traditional Jewish, the essence of traditional Jewish learning, Talmud, on a widespread basis in the Orthodox world to this day. And that, in my mind, again, constitutes discrimination to the detriment of women. Especially in our day, when women and men outside of Judaism receive basically the same education. In terms of most people in the Western world have at least a high school education. They've studied mathematics, sciences, humanities, so that women not studying the same as men in Judaism by way of custom, when there's no prohibition for women to study the same as men, that in my mind constitutes discrimination to the detriment of women. The third issue is the wearing of tefillin. And tefillin are two leather black boxes, that one is worn on the upper arm and the other on the head, above the forehead, between the eyes, that are generally worn. Our practice is to wear them in the morning prayer service, even though that's by custom, by way of law. They can be worn anytime during the day. But the tefillin are an obligation for men to wear tefillin. For women are exempt, and they're not prohibited, they're exempt. So today, certainly outside the Orthodox world, there are women who do want to put on tefillin. Again, the custom has been through the ages that women do not put on tefillin. Today there are women, certainly outside the Orthodox world, who want to put on tefillin the same as a man. And even within at least the modern Orthodox world, there are a number of women who do want to put on tefillin the same as a man. And given that there's no prohibition for doing so. And yet, on a widespread basis in the Orthodox world, modern Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, on a widespread basis, there is protest of such women, whether within the Orthodox world, outside the Orthodox world, of such women putting on tefillin like men. And this protest is widespread, not just among Orthodox men, among Orthodox women who oppose other women putting on tefillin. Again, whether in the Orthodox world, outside the Orthodox world, widespread protests among Orthodox men, women, and of course among Orthodox rabbis. And I'm purposely using the word protest here. Why am I using the word protest? Because in the Talmud, there's a source, Tractate Eruvin 96a, which says that Michal, the daughter of Saul, Saul, the first king of Israel, Michal, the daughter of Saul, the first king of Israel, put on tefillin, the Talmud says, and the Talmud says the sages at the time did not protest. So that very clearly the Talmud is saying here that it's permissible for a woman to put on tefillin, we shouldn't protest, and such widespread protests in the Orthodox world of women today putting on tefillin, such widespread protests, in my mind, is a violation of this Talmudic teaching. Let me just give one example of such. Again, protest is usually it's in the form of rationalization. Various rationalizations that are given why such women should not put on tefillin, which constitutes protest in my mind. So let me give one example in that regard. That one widespread rationalization in the Orthodox world is that women who put on tefillin today are doing so only as an act of provocation, as a political issue, an influence of women's liberation, feminism. and their motives are not pure. They're not pure spiritual motives. And so when people, I think that what such people who make a rationalization of that sort would say regarding the Talmudic source is that the motives of Michal, the daughter of Saul, King Saul, her motives were pure and spiritual, and women today, their motives are not pure. They're of a political nature. And that constitutes a rationalization also of the Talmudic source. So the Talmudic source doesn't speak at all about motivation. And if that was the intent of the Talmudic source, I think, would need to say such a thing, that the reason that the sages didn't protest was because Michal's motives were pure. The Talmudic source is nothing of the sort. And in fact, motivation is really irrelevant to the wearing of tefillin. In other words, for me as a man, I'm obligated to put on tefillin. My motivation is irrelevant. I have to have a basic intent to fulfill the command. This is true with all commandments of the Jewish tradition. But in the case of tefillin, if I simply put on the boxes to play with them, I'm not fulfilling the command. I have to have a basic intent to fulfill the command. Okay, but beyond that, my motivation is irrelevant. If my motive is not pure, I'm still fulfilling the command, even if my motivation is impure, that I want to simply show how pious I am as a person. I'm still obligated to put on the tefillin, and I fulfill the command even if my motive is not pure. So that's irrelevant. That's simply a rationalization, would be a rationalization of the source, that Michal's motives were pure. The source says nothing about that. Okay? So, but beyond that, there's a more serious problem here. To say that women's motivation, women today will put on tefillin, their motivation is really political, it's an act of provocation, that's disparaging of such women. It's to paint them in a very negative light, to portray them in a very negative light. And that is absolutely forbidden in the Jewish tradition, in my mind. First of all, it's a violation of biblical law. If we go back to the 5 books of Moses, the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, where in the same passage where the verse occurs, love your neighbor as yourself, there's also a biblical law there, a commandment, that in righteousness judge your fellow human being. In righteousness. And to disparage somebody is to judge somebody in an unjust way. And on the basis of this biblical law, there's also a fundamental Talmudic teaching, I think one of the most important Talmudic teachings in our tradition, that says that we should judge the entire person favorably. It's usually translated in English as judge every person favorably. It's often understood that way in Hebrew, but it actually says in Hebrew, Avedan et kol ha'adam l'kaf zechut. It actually literally says, judge the entire person favorably. And what that means then is to judge the entire person favorably is in terms of 2 things. First of all, actions. When we judge a person's actions, the person's actions, when we judge, there will be actions that we like and we dislike, actions that we perceive as good and those as bad. And the teaching then demands of us to paint a positive picture of this person, to see the whole person with all of their actions, good and bad, so that if there are actions that we don't like, we disagree with, that we nevertheless portray this person, seeing all of their actions in a positive light. We don't disparage them. And then secondly, in terms of intention, okay, the teaching applies to intention in judging another person in a favorable light. And notice intentions we cannot perceive like actions. There's a remarkable biblical verse in the first book of Samuel, chapter 16, verse 7, and paraphrasing it, but it says that a human being sees with the eyes. We can perceive actions, behavior. But it's only God who sees into the heart, the verse says. We cannot see in the heart, and therefore, just as a matter of trust, we have to judge a person in a favorable light in terms of their intentions and not disparage people. And to say that women are putting on tefillin today simply as an act of provocation or political issues, to disparage them in terms of their motivation and intention. And that, in my mind, is absolutely forbidden according to this Talmudic teaching. And by the way, if we do judge unfavorably and we disparage somebody, notice what follows from that is what's called in the Jewish tradition the evil tongue, lashon hara. The evil tongue means to disparage someone. And oftentimes people will say, but it's true. Well, that's the evil tongue. And by the way, the evil tongue, the laws are even more severe than, say, dietary laws. far more important than what goes into our mouth in Judaism, dietary laws, is far more important is what comes out of our mouth. The rabbis, Talmudic rabbis, compared the evil tongue to murder. Because murder, if you murder somebody, you can't bring the person back to life. There's no correcting the injustice that's been done. And so too, if we disparage somebody, there's no bringing back our words. Once we've disparaged somebody, it's a form of spiritual murder. And so that if we do disparage somebody, to say, but it's true, that's the evil tongue. If we lie, knowingly lie and disparage somebody, that's even worse. But to say that women are putting on tefillin as an act of provocation, that's not only to judge them in a negative light, to disparage them, it's to speak the evil tongue. That's forbidden, so that even if this is your truth, that you perceive them as putting on the tefillin simply as an act of provocation, it's nevertheless forbidden to say such a thing and to disparage them. One other thing in this regard that I'll add is that notice the assumption here of such a rationalization that women shouldn't put on tefillin simply, they're doing it simply as an act of provocation, as if political motives are assumed here is that such political motives are negative. Who says? Aren't such women who I think do want to correct what in their mind is a political and social injustice, that women are not, by way of custom, excluded from a practice that they're permitted to do, that in their eyes is a political injustice. And aren't they being faithful to our biblical heritage? The essence of biblical prophecy, and this is especially true of the great moral prophets following Moses, Amos, Hosea, Micah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. The essence of biblical prophecy is to speak out against injustice. It's to speak in the name of God, as a spokesperson of God, against injustice. The biblical prophecy is not predicting the future. There are, on occasion, prophets who make predictions about the future, but the essence of prophecy is to be a spokesperson for God against injustice. And the essence of the biblical conception of religion is that God demands morality, God demands justice and righteousness. And this is the essence of biblical prophecy. So instead of judging such women in a negative light, that they're putting on the tefillin only as an act of provocation, even if one doesn't agree with them putting on the tefillin, why not at least give them a good feeling and a feeling of appreciation that at least they're faithful to the biblical heritage and wanting to correct what in their eyes is a political injustice. Okay? So that's in terms of the tefillin, which I also see then that women being excluded from putting on tefillin in such widespread protest, in my mind in violation of the Talmud, and such disparagement of women who put on tefillin, in my mind constitutes discrimination to the detriment of women. So what I want to do then now is, by way of conclusion to these 3 videos dealing with the status of women, is I want to make 2 points by way of conclusion. Point number 1. Especially in this 3rd video, I cited cases where the status of women could be improved without even making any change in Jewish law, where cases where women are excluded from practices that they're permitted to do, where they're excluded by custom, and improving the status of women does not require any change whatsoever in Jewish law. Now, widespread in the Orthodox world is an Orthodox ideology, philosophy, that in my mind is a distortion of the Talmud. It emerges in the medieval period in Judaism, an Orthodox ideology that Jewish law does not change. It's eternal and unchanging. This is a distortion of the Talmud. And Talmudic law changes and develops, and the Talmudic rabbis made many changes in Jewish law. And there are just so many examples that could be brought. I'll just cite one example. Capital punishment. The Torah, the 5 books of Moses, ordains capital punishment for various offenses. And yet, in the Talmud, there's a debate regarding capital punishment. And Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tarfon, 2 great Talmudic rabbis, both say that if they were members of the Sanhedrin, the High Court, they were not members of the High Court, but if they were, they say nobody would ever be put to death by capital punishment. And notice, I think, evidently, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon believed in the Torah as representing the will of God, the very word of God, ordaining capital punishment for various offenses, and yet they're opposed in principle. No one would ever be put to death. And the Talmudic rabbis, in accordance with their view, uprooted capital punishment in practice. In theory, it still exists in Judaism, in Jewish law, but in practice, it's virtually impossible to carry out. It's a major change that in practice you cannot carry out what is a biblical law, that the Torah ordains for various offenses, and in practice in Jewish law you can't carry it out. So that I do think there's room for making changes in Jewish law to improve the status of women, but what is really, I find, most difficult and constitutes discrimination to the detriment of women is there's so many cases where women are excluded from practices where they're excluded not by law, simply by custom, and that in my mind again constitutes discrimination to the detriment of women. The last point that I want to make then by way of conclusion is that I think a very strong argument can be made that women are actually from a spiritual point of view superior to men. And oftentimes that's used as a rationalization for inequalities between men and women in Jewish law and in the Jewish tradition. And I'm not saying it as a justification for discrimination against women to the detriment of women. I've acknowledged very clearly that I think there is discrimination to the detriment of women in Judaism. But I do think, as a separate issue, that a strong argument can be made that women are actually superior to men from a spiritual point of view. And I think you can see this in nature with animals. I'll give one example. When I came to Israel, I was on several kibbutzim, communal farms. On one kibbutz that I was on, a communal farm, I worked with sheep and rams, the female sheep and the male rams. And so when I go in to feed the sheep, the female sheep, take 2 buckets of food, one in each hand, and I go in, and I'm not in any danger at all. The female sheep are really, really nice and pleasant, and they're actually a little bit shy. And they'll come up to you very slowly, and they'll back away, then they'll come up to you again and approach you. And then when they come up and approach you, they'll start to play with you, and they'll bite you. And it doesn't hurt at all. They bite in a playful way. It really more tickles than anything. And also when I put the buckets down, they don't headbutt each other. They're pretty civil about, each one taking food. So now when I go to the male rams, that's a whole different story. There, you take 1 bucket of food in one hand and a stick in the other hand, the stick to hit them over the horns. The horns are dead bone, so they don't have any sensation, any feeling. And you have to use the stick with their horns, otherwise you're in big danger of getting headbutted. So you have the 1 bucket in your hand of food, the stick, and you better not turn your back on them, but even if you don't turn your back, be careful with the stick that if they start to charge, you have to just give them a tap on the horns, and that generally deters them and they'll back away. And they're not bad guys, these male rams. They're males. This is their idea of a good time. They headbutt each other. It's not personal. It's fun. It's something like in the human species, let's take American football as an example, or in what was the British Empire, British countries that belonged to the British Empire, rugby. Generally, I think it'll be exceptional that you'll see women who play such sports, violent sports. But men, what a great time, to such violence. And so I think you can see in the animal world that the female species is, I think, superior to the male species. But in this regard, I'll just cite one biblical verse. At the end of chapter 2 in the book of Genesis, there's a remarkable verse that says, "A man should leave his mother and father and cleave unto a woman, and they become one flesh." So that, notice, the woman doesn't leave the mother and father. She's not dependent on the man. She could probably get along very well without a man. It's the man who's dependent on the woman. The man has to leave his mother and father and cleave unto a woman, and they become one flesh. So that I think that reflected in the verse is that women are on a higher level than men spiritually. And with that, I'll finish these 3 videos then. Thank you.